Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have on a very special guest. Today we have on Chuck Wisner. He's president of Wisner Consulting. His client list includes companies such as Google, Rivian, Apple, Tesla, Harvard Business School, Ford, and Chrysler. Chuck was a senior affiliated mediator with the Harvard Mediation Program and was among the first to be certified through the Mastering the Art of Professional Coaching program at the Newfield Institute. He was also a specialist in organizational learning and leadership as an affiliate with MIT Center for Organizational Learning. And his new book, available now, is called The Art of Conscious Conversations, Transforming How We Talk, Listen, and Interact. Welcome, Chuck. It's great to have you on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so in his book, Chuck wrote, I grew up with a racist step-grandfather. His unexamined assumptions, judgments, and prejudices seeped into my unconscious. My brain took in his stories about people of color, hook, line, and sinker. As a child, I didn't consciously choose to adapt his judgments, but in the context of my family, my grandfather's words had authority and his beliefs infused into mine. When I became aware of these harmful racist stories, I was surprised at how ingrained they were. It took time and conscious effort to recognize and acknowledge this pattern and change my thinking, but I can still hear distant whispers of his words in my mind. I know they aren't true, and I'm thankful that I'm free of them. It takes courage to inquire into our thoughts and beliefs. My inquiries were an eye-opener. Questions arose. Why did I feel insecure around certain people? Why did my mouth go dry when I was challenged? Why did I cry at one event and feel untouched by another? Why was I thinking one thing and saying something else? Is it possible what I believed was simply one way of seeing, looking, and feeling? Increasing our awareness of our thoughts while we are engaged in conversation with ourselves and others is an important first step toward having conscious conversations. So I love that. And before we get into some kind of the more technical stuff, I mean, your background is really interesting. And I feel like a lot of our audience and just people, obviously in general, can kind of identify with it because a lot of us, obviously, all of us have backgrounds, right? And a lot of us come from sort of places and from belief systems that are pretty kind of antithetical to values that maybe we have now, right, as adults. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and what is it that got you thinking about, okay, the importance of conscious conversations and also the importance about belief systems, essentially how they affect our decisions, how they affect our happiness, and obviously in this case, how they affect our relationships?
Well, okay. That's a big question. So, yeah, no, well, first I'd say I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. So, and it to this day is a pretty backward conservative place. So that's that context around my grandfather, and partly because of that context, and my parents sent us off to Lutheran Sunday school. Well, they went and had brunch or something, um, and that whole thing didn't sit well with me. And I actually got really early when I was 17. I got interested in Eastern philosophy. And then I started meditating when I was 18. And so that put me on a journey of interesting sort of different way of thinking, because here was this conservative sort of backdrop, and here was this Eastern thinking, which was all about mindfulness and awareness. And so that was the beginning of the journey. And then I moved from there to Boston to go to architecture school. So I was trained as an architect, and then I practiced in Boston for many years as a partner in a firm. And then, to make a long story short, we had a partner problem who was an alcoholic. We hired some help. The help that came in was a woman named Linda Reed. And because of my interest in philosophy and psychology, when Linda came in and helped manage us through this really difficult conversation, I was like, how did she do that? That was like magic. And so that sparked an interest in me. I mean, that sparked another curiosity in me. And we became friends, and I started studying. And that's when I did the Harvard mediation work. And then I did the ontology of language work. And one thing led to another. I sort of like 4 years of retooling myself. And then I left architecture, and everyone said, you're friggin' nuts. But I started a new career because it was sort of like a calling, really. And then in that study of language, that's where I woke up to the power of our thoughts, the power of our words and conversations.
Wow, it's really interesting. Yeah. As far as when you first learned about Eastern philosophy, 17, 18, What was it exactly? Or could you maybe describe what was the feeling you had in terms of shifting from like that conservative view to that sort of Eastern philosophic view?
Yeah, which is a little bit more
Yeah,
holistic and all-encompassing, right? As opposed to the rigidity of conservatism.
yeah. I think it was like for me, viscerally, it was like a veil sort of being taken away, so that I could see things that I could never see before, or think about things in a way that I never thought of them before, and that then and then if you start meditating, of course, that's a whole new way of having a relationship with your own mind, right? So that combination of those things. And I love a quote. One of my teachers, his name was Rafael Echeverria, um, from Newfield. He said, if I took you to Alaska or the North Pole and we spent 6 months with Inuits, they have 27 names for snow,
Mm-hmm.
and you learn those names for snow. When we came back to Boston, you would never see snow the same way. And I think of the book that way, that I wanted to give people ways of thinking about words and conversations, so that they couldn't just be in it innocently, but they actually could say, oh, that's how it works, and that's why I get screwed up, or that's why I get stressed out about a certain thing. So it's giving us distinction so we can hear and see and then act and speak differently. That
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah.
No, for sure. Yeah, definitely. It gives a totally different, fresh perspective to the dynamics of conversation as far as that goes.
Right.
And I'm curious, what are some of the problems that you've seen people have when they're relating to each other, whether it's like in a business environment or let's say personally, in terms of conversation?
Yeah, I think for me, in business, we can talk about both. In
Mhm.
business, one of the biggest things I see, and I still see, is how we're trained as leaders to be smart. And of course, we're paid to be smart and know our business. But that notion of expertise also is a trap, because then we fall into what's called knowingness. That
Mhm.
because we're a leader, we have to have the answer, and that if we all have our opinions, but if you're a leader and you're speaking your opinion, but you're speaking your opinion as though it is the answer, then you're shutting down conversations. And I think this tendency for leaders to feel like they have to have the answer and then show up as a knower instead of a learner is
Mm-hmm.
is a big sort of, they're set up to do that basically, because they're rewarded for raising their hand and having the answer, you know.
Right.
So that's an interesting thing, where I think our opinions, whether in business or out of business, our opinions, we speak them and we hold them so dearly because they're part of our identity, and our egos are there, right? You are right, I'm wrong. I'm right, you're wrong, rather. And so that's a trap.
Yeah.
Right. And people get so attached, right, to their identities and their expertise, right, that they almost can't they can't be wrong, essentially, right? It's like people might
Right.
even get into arguments at work, right, holding on to like, oh no, I'm right, you're wrong, and they don't try to understand what the other person's perspective is. They're kind of married to their point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's a trap, because our ego and our identity is attached to our opinions, right? Well, let me say our uninvestigated opinions, right? If you have it and you hold it. So the analogy, the metaphor I like to use is, it's like we can go into a conversation with our opinion, but it's like holding it with a fist.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I come into it with a fist and you come into it with a fist, we have battle, right? And then people get defensive, and we're just standing there arguing our positions, but we don't deconstruct anything. We don't investigate our thoughts more deeply, right? And so in the book, I talk about what are the ways, and the four questions that I bring up, what are the ways that we can open our hand and go, yeah, I have an opinion, but this is why I have it. These are the standards I hold. This is the facts that matter. Here's how it affects me emotionally, and power issues. And so we can actually deconstruct all of that. And then if we model that, it's actually encourages other people to sort of slowly open their hands, and so we can have a much more, a much, I guess deeper is the right word, a much deeper conversation where we're actually getting under the opinion to what's feeding that.
Right. And I've been having conversations with people lately. So I'm a psychotherapist. So I've been having conversations with other therapists about, so what does it mean to be an expert in this field? So what's so interesting about that is oftentimes, and this is a little bit more psychoanalytic, where you would hang on and hold on dearly or deeply to these interpretations of what's going on with the other person, where do their problems stem from, what are the sort of resolutions to them. So we've been having conversations about what it means to actually be an expert. And oftentimes, especially, I don't think that this is just prevalent to our generation, because I mean, this has always been the case. I mean, this is a business, right?
Sure.
So we need to be able to market ourselves. So, but what's interesting is now with social media and the way that we have to kind of brand ourselves in the way, so to speak, that we have to kind of seem as experts. So whether you're making videos on TikTok, you're writing a blog, whatever it is, right? You're having a podcast. And so you have to seem like you know all of the answers. And the idea sometimes is that, well, what happens if I don't have all of the answers? Will I get clients? Will people take me seriously?
Right.
I mean, the market is saturated with therapists. You could go on TikTok and get advice from God knows how many of them. So what does this mean for me, right? And so oftentimes, and this is something that Julia Galef calls the soldier mindset, we kind of get entrenched in our thinking, and it's because we're defending ourselves, right? We're sort of keeping our clients kind of close to us, and we're saying, no, don't go to this one, come to me, right? I'm the all-knowing one. So the conversation. Yeah, go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah. I have the answer. I will save you.
Yeah, and I will save you, right? So so some of the conversations that we've been having is about, in terms of now vulnerability, is how is it that we can kind of keep our clients while accepting that we don't know everything? Because yes, even though we know diagnoses, we have obviously some fundamental understanding of theory. I mean, obviously we have to, but the point is that we don't know this specific person's problems exactly as they are, and also we don't really know how to resolve them. What might be a great solution for one person might not necessarily be for another. And also resistance is what it is, not just because they're not doing what's best for them, but because there are trade-offs. And sometimes, like, again, because we don't know everything that's going on in the person's mind, for that person, that trade-off might actually not be worth it, even though for us it may be, right? So going into this sort of notion of what it means to be an expert, what I find with my clients, and I'm sure other obviously people do too, is that the more open you are, counterintuitively, right? The more open you are and the more engaging you are in terms of this dialogue where you're fruitfully coming to something together, in a dialectical way. What happens is actually they tend to now view you as the expert. So, as like the kind of young therapist that I was at a point, I was thinking like, oh my God, they're going to think I'm stupid. They're not going to want to come see me. Who's going to want to pay for this, right? But then what you're finding is in these discussions, the more you say you don't know, obviously there's a limit to this, but the more you say you don't know, the more the person feels like they're engaging you on the same level. So these roles, right? And this is what I want to talk about now, getting into stories, right? These roles that we take on, that an expert is this, right? A client or a patient is that, subordinate is this, right? It's sort of very soldier-like, right? Very military-like. So can we talk a little bit about that, about how stories affect us, and essentially not only how stories are super rigid, but how they're also very simplistic?
They're simplistic and they're complex at the same time, because it's easy to latch onto one. That's the simple part. It's like, because it makes us feel good, or whether we got a good result that time. But the stories that aren't serving us, the stories that are harmful, are much more complex. So it's then that's where the work is. That's where the investigation begins, right? So in your story about being the expert psychologist or psychoanalyst, I often say to my clients, look at, because they come to me and they are, you're the expert. You know how to do this. You've been doing it for 50 years, for God's sake, 25. But it's like, I say, if you want to change a habit, or you want to change a behavior, if I said to you, okay, I have this magic switch, and if I make the switch, you pay me $10,000 and you'll never do that again. Will you pay me? Of course I'll pay you. Well, if that were true, I'd be a rich man. But I say there's no magic switch. We have to investigate. We have to get underneath. We have to ask questions. And so what you were doing in your shift from fear of being an expert to the ability to sort of be in conversation with your clients, you were doing that. You were helping them investigate. I would suspect that you ended up asking more questions than you were telling them the answers.
Yeah. And I think what they appreciate about that is the exploration, just of getting to know them. So it's not so much about answers, I'm finding, is as people just love to have somebody just know them or get to know them and try to actually help them problem solve in a way that's not sort of cookie cutter, right? Because if you're
Yeah.
looking at therapy in this very manualized way, it sort of just seems like you're trying to make a buck and get, the person, get them out the door, right?
Right.
Medicine does that, and that's absolutely fine. I mean, you don't have to have a deeply personal relationship with your doctor, obviously, but obviously in psychotherapy, it doesn't necessarily work that way. When a person feels like that you don't have a deeply intimate understanding of their problem, they're never going to accept your solution. And most of the time, your solution is just going to be what everybody else has told them. And they're thinking already, it's like, well, this person doesn't understand me. Why is now this guy that I'm paying going to understand me?
Yeah. And so that ability to help them sort of look under their story or
Yeah.
under the emotion they're feeling, because I think in the book I really say we forget that our emotions are real, but they're driven by our stories.
Yeah.
But whether conscious or unconscious, we feel hurt or we feel angry, there's a story underneath there. And if we can investigate that story, we can untangle it and decide, do I want to keep it? Do I want to change it? Do I want to transform it? And that is the work they have to do. And what I can do is guide them, and what you can do is guide them
Yeah,
toward that.
what I really love about this is that not to kind of go off the rails here, but there's because it's still relevant. But so there's a client of mine, and she really struggles with the kind of story she tells herself based on her relationship with her mother. So the idea
Mm,
there is that nothing is really ever good enough, right? So no matter what she does, it's like there's always the goalpost, right? It's always sort of being moved. It's like, oh, this is great, but then I don't have that. Oh, I finally
yeah.
have that, yeah, but now that's missing something else. So the thinking there is that these stories of like who I am, what I'm capable of, whatever, it's sort of been implanted in me, and now it's kind of hard for me to break out of. So in cognitive behavioral therapy terms, what she does a lot of the times is she disqualifies the positive. So anything good that happens for whatever reason doesn't count. And there's a lot of black and white thinking, right? Where it's like, if I'm not doing like everything, or if I don't have everything, whatever everything is, right? Because we don't really have a
Right.
concept of what that is, right? It's like nothing else sort of matters. And what's been really interesting with her is that we've really been talking about, first of all, why that story was there in the first place and who benefited from it. So for
Mm-hmm.
her, the thinking was like, well, this is just how things are, right? So with standards, right? You talk about standards. So these are just what
Right.
the standards should be. And my question was, okay, well, knowing what you know about, your mom, about your parent, knowing that, kind of she struggled with envy, she struggled with giving many people credit, she struggled with her own self-esteem, right? But could it be maybe possible that there was some sort of ulterior motive behind this standard or this story? That it's not
Mm-hmm.
just so that, oh, well, this is just the right way to live, or this is the right standard to have, that maybe she kind of benefited from you never feeling good about herself, about yourself. And so
Yeah.
now, as we kind of have this dialogue and again this exploration, the thinking is like, yeah, objectively speaking, like, what is there in the world that tells me I shouldn't feel good about my life now? So I kind of moved to be near my friends, which I never thought I'd do because I was really career oriented. I have these really great relationships with people who care about me. I'm kind of finally exploring the world in the way that I didn't before, because I was really too afraid to take really significant risks outside of work. And I'm happier, right? I'm happier than I've ever been. But then I still have this nagging standard in the back of my mind, and I'm not really
Yeah.
sure what to do with that, right? And the main question is, yes, but how do we know that that should be the standard?
So
Yeah.
just
Yeah. Exactly. Thank you.
right, and to add to that, it's something that this is something I love in your book, and if people really understand this, this could be mind like this could be life changing essentially. So being aware that the stories that you tell yourself aren't essentially real, like in the sense that you could be referring to real things, but it's like
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is that you believe, you look for evidence of essentially, right? And a lot of
Right.
these stories that we tell ourselves are on autopilot. It's not like I like to make this distinction. Probably other people have made this distinction as well, I'm assuming, but um there's a difference or a distinction between when thoughts come to you automatically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you're actually in a sort of a brainstorming mode, in the sense of like, oh, I'm in sort of like a creative space right now, trying to maybe think of something. But uh it's distinct in the sense that those thoughts that come to you on autopilot, it just comes from essentially your conditioning, your beliefs, uh feelings that you have, right? And it's interesting. It's like, well, if the distinction is when I'm in this mode of this automated mode, right? This isn't something that I'm choosing to think.
Right.
Why should I necessarily buy into these things that are coming up into awareness, right?
Right. Right.
which is very interesting because a lot of people, before, maybe reading your book or even being aware of this, they probably don't know that that they're essentially buying into these stories that they're telling themselves. It's just like, oh no, these are my thoughts, or this is me.
This standard is natural, right? Like what I was saying about with my client.
Yeah,
Right?
but when you become aware of it,
Yeah.
that starts the process of sort of disentangling you from that, and then all of a sudden you're like,
Right.
well, 1 second, if what I believe, if I look for evidence of what it is that I believe, or identify with things that I think about, well, then that's interesting. Is it possible I could have another belief? Is it possible that I could do away with beliefs? Not necessarily, but you start to have these kinds of thoughts.
Right.
Is it possible that maybe I can identify with something else if I have to identify with something? If I must have like some sort of ego, right? Maybe okay, let's actually, maybe I can design this ego in some ways, right? It's very fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and the idea of disidentification, it's like we do operate on autopilot a lot, and there's a good thing because then I don't have to think about how to tie my shoe every time I want to tie my shoe, or where I'm driving home. I don't have to really pay attention. So that can serve us, but it often is serving us badly, especially in conversation where on autopilot our story just shows up. And then, our background conversation, the monkeys in our mind, right, are really what's feeding that. There's a negativity there often. And unless we shine the light on that, the light of awareness on that, and then go and do the investigation, because what do I have like with your client, do I have this great desire for my mother to approve of me? Well, let's investigate that, or I have a concern that I'm never doing things well enough. Let's investigate that, and the authority issues. Am I giving my power away, or who do I give? What voices do I give authority to? And then the standards issue, which you talked about, which is huge. I mean, every judgment we have is based on probably a standard we did not choose.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of times that comes up in relationships where, so in therapy, I would ask my clients, like, do you guys ever talk to your partners about value systems? And oftentimes they're like, oh, that seems like so kind of like evident, right? Like so obvious. Like, yeah, I should probably talk to them about values, right? And a lot of times we miss those important conversations where, and you talk about this as well, obviously, when we're thinking of different standards, like where people clash in conversation is because you have two different standards and people are sort of talking past each other, right? Where one person doesn't understand that they've done the wrong thing and, that other person's standard, and then the other person doesn't get why they don't kind of understand it. Yeah. So can we talk a little bit about that, how standards clash and how we often miss that with one another?
Yeah. And I think the reason that there's two reasons that we don't talk about them. One is that we didn't, probably 90% of our standards, we did not consciously choose.
Yeah.
So as we're growing up with our parents and our religious training and our schooling and our, all of that kind of stuff, we sort of adopt standards that make sense to us and probably serve us at the time. They serve us in some way. They make us safe, or they make us feel like we're doing good work. So there's that, and then the other piece is they're so obvious to us that they live in the background of our consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So in the book, I'm saying let's bring them forward so we can say, in a conversation with a couple, they might be fighting over something, and it gets nowhere. But as soon as we raise the issue, I'll use the example. My wife and I, we've been married 40 years, so it's been a while that this has been true. But she likes to go to bed like a maid. She likes to clean up the kitchen and wake up like a queen. I'd rather go to bed like a king and have to clean up in the morning. I mean, we could fight over that, and we could really get upset about that. But if we just say, "Oh, wow, you just have a different standard. You have a different desire here, and I have a different one," and then we can laugh at it, and sometimes she wins, and sometimes I win. Most of the time, I just say, "Let's clean up," because then I get to experience what it feels like to go wake up like a king.
Yeah.
So that's a tiny little example, but it escalates really quickly into more serious things, right? Values and morals and stuff like that.
And what's great is by you trying to understand what it is her values are, right? I mean, she probably does this back with you, but assuming, let's say, another person didn't, at least when
Hmm.
you try to understand them and you show that you're trying to understand them, they kind of lower their guard a little bit. That whole fighting for my side is right and your side is wrong thing, when they
Right,
feel understood, it starts to build that rapport, right? And then
right.
that trust that comes with it. And then all of a sudden they're a little more open to maybe something that you believe or that you're thinking. And then all of a sudden that changes the dynamic, right? Instead of like a fight or an argument, it becomes this sort of collaborative thing where you might be able to integrate both sides and then come out with more understanding and peace long term, essentially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and in a way, if you can just say, well, instead of arguing about this or fighting, here's the thinking underneath my emotional feeling of anger or whatever. Here's my thinking, and my standard is X. I think the kids should be doing this, or I think we should be treating people this way, or we should deal with our friends this way. By revealing that, there's some vulnerability there
Hmm.
because these standards are we're so much identified with them. But if we can bring them into the open and open our hand and say, here's my standard, but that's a really great thing that invites other people then to do the same thing.
Yeah, I love
Yeah,
that.
and if you don't, so usually we tend to also project, right? Our
Mm,
like this is the problem going back to storytelling. We project our feelings out there onto other people, or at least it definitely comes off, right?
yeah.
What could be a way or some method that maybe somebody in the audience would be able to sort of silence that storytelling in order to be, how should I say, more actively engaged and focused in that conversation without that background story running.
Yeah. Um, so there's two things that I like to sister up. I didn't talk about one of them in the book. Have you guys ever heard of voice dialogue? Um,
No,
No.
what's that?
so, well, I worked with these two doctors 20 years ago or so, and they had a process called voice dialogue. And what it is it's recognizing. And by the way, 20 years later, now neuroscience is catching up and saying, yeah, this is what's happening. In
Mhm.
our minds, we all have multiple personalities. Like we all have, there's archetypes, the critic, the judge, the hurt little boy, the hurt little girl, so there's these archetypes, right? And the idea is that they, at some point, they served us well because they helped us deal with a difficult family situation, a difficult parent, or some other social issue. So they served us well. But as we mature and become adults, right, those voices are still inside of our mind, and each of them can, when something happens, we get triggered. The hurt little boy might surface up and take over me and go and be really super upset, right? And so the idea of voice dialogue is to be familiar with those stronger voices that we have inside and to actually work with them,
Hmm.
and to actually, because each voice, each personality has its own ego and its
Yeah.
own story. I came alive when Chuck was 5 and I needed to protect him from his grandfather.
Hmm.
you know so
Hmm.
there's that whole notion of just becoming familiar with some of our internal voices. And then the other piece that's in the book is the deconstructing and becoming familiar with our inner dialogue. And I've done this exercise of the left hand, right hand column exercise, which is public and private conversations with hundreds of people. And it amazes me. The exercise is to write a conversation that's upsetting, 4 or 5 exchanges. I said, she said, I said, she said. And then on the other side, write what you were feeling when both parties were, what you were thinking and feeling when both parties were talking.
Huh.
And what amazes me is how many people, that's shocking to them, how negative and how loud those voices are.
Hmm.
Because we're so accustomed to it just being there. It's like it's running in the background, right?
Mhm.
And so as soon as we put it on paper, we go, holy shit,
Yeah.
that was really a judgmental, I'm really like negative all over this conversation, right? And that's very common, it's very normal. But the idea is you can turn that negativity into gold, because in that negativity are your concerns, your desires, your judgments, your standards, and power issues.
Yeah. So
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So would that work, especially in terms of like, let's say we have somebody who has a deep mistrust of people generally, right? So they have certain interpretations, right? So I think that's pretty much what we're talking about here. When you're having a conversation, we have like these stories. We not only tell ourselves about ourselves, but also obviously about other people. So we have certain So we have certain interpretations of what people mean by what they say, right? And I would say we frequently, and maybe not always, but we frequently misunderstand each other, and that's based on some of those core beliefs that we have about them, how they perceive us, what they expect of us, etc. Right? So how would you address that with a person who has a deep mistrust of people, and where their understanding is? And I think this really fits in with the conversation about leadership, right? Because sometimes, and we had Ryan Stelzer on, shout out to him. We talked about sort of like these bosses who essentially think of their workers as lazy, right? So it's a sort of mistrust. Yeah, the idea is like, well, you guys are lazy, so I have to crack the whip on you consistently. If I don't do that, you're not going to do your work, right? So how do we kind of start to tackle that and look at these interpretations, especially with somebody who is consistently and chronically defensive, where they consistently see people as like mistrusting, manipulative, sort of divisive, right? Not seeing any of that within themselves, of course. But the interpretation is frequently, well, oh, you're trying to get away with something, or you're trying to get one over me. I may not be able to figure out what it is, what your angle or what your motive is, but there's something definitely there.
Yeah. So trust is such a big topic. We could spend a lot of time on it. But I would say with someone like that had a big story of distrust, I would ask them to come up with 2 or 3 examples. Give me some examples that viscerally this feels, distrustful. You feel distrusted, or you don't trust somebody else. Mm-hmm. And because in that example, then we can do the deconstruction. We can say, well, let's find some facts here. What actually happened? What actually in the conversation or in the relationship has happened in the past or yesterday or today that can support or can ground or not ground your fear, right? That's a lot harder to do than it sounds, because it means you really have to go, wait a minute, I do have a story, but did they ever do something? Or did they said this, or the person might say to me, well, they said this to me. And I said, well, they said, is this the right way to go? And I'm saying, but is that a fact that supports your grounding of they don't trust you, or you don't trust them, or you can't trust them? And I would say no. So then, okay, so maybe we can exhaust that there are no facts, but then we go deeper and go, so what are you feeling? The emotional part. And then if they say, well, I feel X, then I would say, let's deconstruct that. Let's ask, what do you want out of this? What are there power issues? What are the standards? And just by the real examples is an easier way to take things apart and have some aha moments. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then, and I'm also thinking now of comparing the standards, right? So, because here's what happens oftentimes when I talk to people who are super defensive, you often find that their standard is kind of absurd, right? So what happens when they say, well, somebody is lazy, they actually have plenty of evidence for it, but it also doesn't necessarily fit with the normal conception of what laziness is. So for them, what's lazy might not be lazy for somebody else, right? So when they say, oh no, yeah, we could go through the evidence. Oh my God, of course this guy's lazy. So we're expected to, let's say, work 60 hours a week, right? He doesn't want to do that. He only wants to work 40. Can you believe this lazy prick? And so, when you start to think about like what these terms mean, you're like, oh, I understand. We're getting now into different examples, right? So now when you look at the evidence of what is and isn't lazy, now we're going back to the conversation of standards.
Yeah. And with that person though, with that person, then you can have a conversation about 40 hours versus 60 hours.
Yeah.
Because if I was that person, I say, but when I was hired, I was told it's a 40-hour a week gig, right? But now 6 months later, I'm being shunned and criticized because I'm not here, 14 hours a day.
Yeah.
That's a different conversation than I don't trust you or you're lazy, right? It's a much more productive conversation where we can get somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? It might even lead to like, well, when we hired you, we weren't honest.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
okay, I'm out of here. Bye.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That could be the case. But say in the case where it isn't that, and just people are sort of assuming that, people are being lazy, or I can't trust this person. I mean, it kind of goes back to something we were talking about before. The ego is insidious in the sense that, like, if you
Mm,
actually believe that, you look for evidence of that, right? And so you kind of anytime any evidence outside of that reality, outside of that view comes in, you kind of nix it out because it doesn't go with that belief that you
that's
have,
right. Right.
which is just I mean, I know that it's definitely better though to do the method that you have in the book, right? Which is ask yourself these questions so this we can kind of suss out what's my evidence for this, what are my desires, essentially, like, by outlining it and putting it on paper, you actually are able to understand better what it is that's going on, because again, things happen so automatically, or we forget and we go on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So by
Right.
organizing our thoughts this way and then seeing that insidious nature, that's definitely, not even insidious, actually, my bad, you'll at least see
Mm.
what your intentions are, and maybe try to gauge the intentions of others as well, and that's definitely helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it's like I like the analogy of this notion of awareness is primary. Becoming a witness to your own thoughts is really a primary activity, right? That
Mhm.
if you can do that, and then you can write some things down, what you're doing is these personalities that might take over, you're putting them aside and you're getting some perspective. You're looking at yourself from up here going, oh wow, it's there is that thinking. But incredibly, we humans have this incredible capacity to be aware of our own thinking,
Mhm.
which sets us apart from many other living things, living animals. So that is that separation, which is also gives us some separation from our ego and our identity, you know. And I
Yeah.
don't ask anybody to give up their ego or identity, but I do is I ask them to look at it, right? And
Yeah.
if you're going to give it up, do it consciously, not do it out of anger, and because you can do that and you can end up beating yourself up for 6 months because you now labeled yourself an asshole.
Right. Right.
But plus, which is really interesting, is if you are able to quiet the ego, or just be put it aside, essentially, at least in conversation with someone, then there can't be, or you definitely minimize any sorts of projections. You're actually really able to be fully there, listen to them,
Mm,
and not have this sort of impulse to either jump at something they're saying, or react, essentially. You're actually able to then, if I could borrow this term, just basically just to respond, essentially, instead of react. So this
right.
way, it also has sort of a different, uh, I would say, energetic sort of charge to it too. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, people even are so sensitive to, like, whatever even state of mind you're in. Like, there's sort of like a transference that occurs, whether, like, if you're angry, then the words that come out, they're coded with anger. They have that, even
Right.
tonally, or something in your face, or some sort of nonverbal cue. But if you're actually legitimately calm, then it has sort of a different flavor to it, and then
Mm,
people kind of feel that. And then it's interesting because, like, conversations can go, let's see if I could get this on camera, like, any which way. Like, I imagine it like a
yeah.
tree, like, with roots, and you could take this path, and, like, this is the angry path, and if you started this way and then you go all this way, you could create, like, this chain of like a really horrible interaction, essentially, or maybe even dissolve a relationship. But
Yeah.
if you take that more harmonious path, and you're more aware of what's going on, then of course you're going to have long-term benefits. I'll just add
Right.
one extra thing. Like, for example, if I ever had an argument with a friend before, right? And this
Mhm.
is, like, let's say, my best friend, essentially. And I perceive this thing that he did as, it feels at the moment like it's this unforgivable thing, or I feel like very charged about it. But
It hurt.
then
Yeah.
at Yeah, but then at the same time, that thing that happened with my friend, it's literally like it's this size, right?
Yeah,
But my
right. Yeah.
friendship is,
Mhm.
where is
Yes,
it?
right.
Okay, it's like that much is going on. So it's like, then I think about it, I'm like, is it really worth it to zero in on this, get into that crazy argument with my friend, or maybe be like, you know what, let's zoom out for a second and be like, this is how I felt about what happened here. What were you
Right.
thinking when you did this?
Right.
What was your intention? Oh, you were
Hmm.
thinking that? Ah, that's interesting, because I was thinking this, and then you start to
You unwind the
untangle.
tension.
Yeah, yeah,
You unwind the tension. Yeah. Yeah. Our bodies are way ahead of our thinking. Um, uh, and what I mean by that is something happens, we have an emotional reaction. And if we really learn to tune into our bodies, it's going to tell us before our prefrontal cortex kicks in and has us being defensive, right?
Mhm.
mm,
Um, and so that notion of being listening to your body as well, because some people get stressed out, like my mouth might dry out, or people's shoulders might, or people might get sick to their stomach. Those are all signs, like, to relax and go, wait a minute, I have a fear here, and let me be open about that. Wow, that really scares the hell out of me,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden the conversation changes because I'm showing some vulnerability. I'm willing to open my hand and reveal my thinking, and that's very addictive. Addictive isn't the right word. That's very inviting
Right.
mm,
to other
yeah.
people, because if you can relax and be a bit vulnerable, whether they know it or not, your whole presence is broadcasting that, and that's feels good.
Right. So
So
you guys,
go ahead.
yeah, so you guys are referring to the collaborative form of conversation. So Chuck, can you get into
Yeah,
the,
yeah.
we probably should have talked about this a little earlier. Can you get into the four types of conversations? Yeah.
um, yeah. Well, we spent a lot of time on stories, which is okay
Yeah.
because that's fundamental. Like, if we don't do our work, our individual work, um, we can't listen better,
Mhm.
Right. Yeah.
right? And so the second conversation, the collaborative conversation, is really the dance. It's the dance of advocacy and inquiry. It's like, I have a position, you have a position, we could do this, or we could do this, and we could find this,
Mhm.
right? That's the art of that conversation. And if I'm stuck on a story, or if I'm going with a position that I'm so identified with that I have to defend it, good luck. You can read all the books you want on listening. You can read all the books you want on collaboration, and you won't be able to do it if you don't learn to investigate your own crap.
Mhm.
Mm,
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when you do that conversation well, it's the dance where, like, even in our hour together, the dance of sharing ideas and things. You guys are talking, an ideal bubbles up for me, and then I share that, and then a question bubbles up for you.
Mhm.
That's that real ability. We're really listening, or we're sharing ideas in that space of open dialogue. And David Bohm his ideas around dialogue are fabulous. That's when we slip into the creative conversation, because then ideas start generating,
mm,
and some idea might come up out of our conversation that none of us individually had in our heads,
Mhm.
because we had that open conversation where we're learning from each other, we're dancing with each other, and ideas are bubbling up, and then all of a sudden there's oh, we could do this together, or we could do that together, right? And so
Mhm.
the creative conversation is that, and it's also learning to trust our own intuition.
Mhm.
It's learning to be present, to listen more deeply to ourselves, to be in our bodies. That's part of creativity. Like I say, my favorite thing, I have a couple acres of land. My favorite thing is to go out there without a plan and
Mhm.
just,
mm,
like, let no control. I'm not in control. I'm just going to go see what happens. And then either the chainsaw will talk to me, or a tree will talk to me, or the gardener will talk to me, and I just start doing stuff. And
Mhm.
that's a practice of just being in our creative space and trusting our minds and trust our intuition. That's right. And so storytelling is sort of expanding how we think. Creativity is expansion. Creativity, collaboration is expansion. Creativity is expansion. And then the last conversation is commitment conversation, and that's a contraction.
Mm.
because it's going, okay, we've done all this great thinking together. We have great ideas. We have to make a decision. And so the commitment conversation is just that, the promises we make to each other. And we do this day in and day out, but we do it unconsciously because it's so common, but we do it in many ways sloppily. And so learning this, how to make requests and say yes or say no or counteroffer, means we can make better promises. And when we make better promises and we fulfill them, we build trust. So there's that loop there.
Right. I suppose people run into problems of promising things that they can't commit to, right? Like maybe in order to people please, or just to move on past that particular maybe conversation or instance.
Yeah.
But it's as you're saying, it's better to just be authentic. Like, no, I don't think I could meet this by this deadline, but let's work towards maybe setting it to this date, and then I can have something for you, or we can have something for you. Yeah, essentially that is interesting. Yeah, I could see people being people pleasery, I suppose, and avoiding commitments. Maybe there's other issues that kind of come into play, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's not just people pleasing, it's also power issues, authority issues.
Yeah.
Because you say, if you don't have psychological safety, say with your boss or with your team, right? And someone says, hey, can you do a report for Monday morning? And you don't feel safe to say no, or you don't feel safe to counteroffer and say, gosh, my weekend's sort of tied up with a family wedding. I don't have time. I can give it to you by Tuesday. If you don't feel safe, you're going to say sure. And then you're going to suffer all weekend and probably deliver a crappy package on Monday morning. Right. So there's a lot of issues of power and whose voices we can say yes to, no to, counteroffer to. The counteroffer move in requests and commitment conversations is a really underappreciated, underused linguistic action.
Yeah. Well, my favorite part about all the conversations, and just because of what we do and what I do just on my own, is the creative part. So I often talk about the show about the Wu-Tang Clan on Hulu because it's so cool. So what's really cool about just how they formed and everything is so it is a lot of creativity and creative conversations and dialogues. So what's so cool about that is that initially, I'm not going to get into the whole story because it's a little bit too much, but the idea is the founder of the Wu-Tang Clan, RZA, Bobby, so the character who plays Bobby, in the show, essentially he goes off on his own and he creates this sort of character that doesn't really do much in the music industry, and then eventually he kind of fades away and the record company dumps him and they're like, okay man, sorry, it just didn't work out, right? And he's thinking, wow man, maybe I need my brothers, like maybe I need people with me to do this with me. And there's this sort of speaking of ego, because his ego kind of goes down, right? It's sort of mitigated by reality, right? Yeah. It's sort of mitigated by reality, right? And then he realizes, okay, so here's this sort of talent around me, right? And how do I kind of make it work in a way where we're all we're working kind of together, right? We're working together, and there's a somewhat of a, what would you call it, like a synchronicity of sorts, right? Like we work together and we create this thing, and we don't really know who gets credit for what, right? It just sort of happens. And what you find a lot of times in the history of the greatest sort of let's say minds, or in terms of culture and productivity and let's say art, whatever you want to call it, is that you do often find that when you do have these creations, it's really hard to tell who did what, right? Who contributed how and who was responsible for what, because there's so much going on and so many ideas going on in these conversations that, again, it's hard to actually pinpoint it to a particular source. So when we start thinking about creativity, right, what would you say is sort of the ideal way to foster sort of creative dialogue, right? If there is one, right? How do we get to a point where now, we stop thinking so much about who gets credit, right? Who is who gets the most airtime, who is the leader, right? Who is sort of the person in charge or whatever it is, and we get to a point where it's really the ideas and the art that matters most.
Yeah. Were you going to say something?
No. I was just agreeing with him, doing like
agree.
a little
Okay. Yeah. I think so. You mentioned who gets the credit and how these things work. We all know the term brainstorming, but historically, what has happened with that term is that we say, okay, let's do a brainstorm. And someone gets up on a whiteboard and draws something. I mean, I'm a big fan of drawing on whiteboards, and because I'm an architect, I do a lot of graphical stuff, graphics. So when I do it, but the first thing that comes out of someone's mouth is, that'll never work. Right? That shuts down the conversation. So the creative conversation just goes, right? Now
Yeah.
we're in judgment. And then someone says, well, why wouldn't it work? You know, and then we're off on a tangent, right? And so the whole notion of, like I mentioned David Bohm before, his idea of dialogue. He was oh, help me out here. He's a physicist.
Well, he's a physicist. Yeah.
Yeah.
He studied quantum mechanics.
That's right. So his whole notion of dialogue is literally, and I've done this with teams in tension. You're sitting in a circle, and the idea is everybody has a thought, everybody has an opinion, and you get to suspend your judgments, set them aside, but you get to speak your opinion, and no one gets to respond. No one gets to say, no, not a good idea. That'll never work, right? And so you keep hearing these voices and voices. And what happens is there becomes this synergy in the room where people really start saying, oh, wow, there's another way. I've never thought of it but that way. And there's another, wow, whoa. And that's when we're in that's when then the creative space is open, because minds are opening instead of shutting down, right? And so, boy, to practice that, a leader really has to purposefully say, this is what we're going to do for a half an hour. We're just going to share ideas, but no one can judge, no one can shut anybody down. But that takes courage to do it, because it's so out of the norm. But if you really want to foster creative ideas, just let the ideas flow, and let that sort of inner, this is a much deeper subject, but if any of us think about where our best ideas come from, good luck finding that source.
Right.
And what it is when we are in our bodies and we are relaxed and we are not stressed and we're saying, wow, let's just dream, let's wonder, I wonder what's possible. That's when ideas just bubble up, because we're literally creating that space.
Yeah, that's a genius structure. Yeah, like just literally saying, oh, okay, you cannot give any judgments. Like everybody will actually be stating their ideas in a circle right now for this time that we set out. That's I love it. So this, I guess I can't mention it, but this company that I work at, generally speaking, we have good cohesion. Like I wouldn't say there's any particular issues with that, but that gave me an idea. Now I want to try that, because we don't really shut down ideas though, but I could see how setting out a time for that might make a lot of ideas come out, as opposed to you only get a few out and then it just, everybody starts commenting on each idea that's presented.
The trap there to be aware of is that the power issues.
I was thinking that too.
Whether someone has more stripes than you, or someone's the extrovert and you're the introvert, or someone just tends to talk a lot, or people give a certain person's voice more power because they have more experience. So that's a dynamic to be super aware of, because the stripes and the different ways for people to speak can shut down that conversation.
There was just really quick.
Let me just add one. Well, I'm sorry. One little piece I don't want to forget. In that practice, I'm joking with folks, and my next book might be about the pain of meetings, but literally to have a group of people and to say, okay, we all have a perspective on this problem, right? Let's hear those perspectives. Let's just hear your story, right? And then let's say, okay, let's now collaborate on that. What do we know? What are the facts? What do we don't know? And then we go, and that's where we allow that collaborative learning thing. And then we slip into creative, what's possible. Now we say, okay, there's 5 different ways. There's 6 different ways. That's a very simple but purposeful way to lead teams and to guide people into a more awake conversation.
Right. And I think the point that you get at it, and I think it's super important, is that so many of us have ideas that could possibly be looked at as genius, but they don't get to be, right? Because we don't necessarily have the ability, the psychological safety to voice them. And so an example that comes to mind, if you guys have ever watched the show on WeWork with Adam Newman, so Jared Leto plays him. So there's this really great scene with it where the Adam Newman character, I'm sure he said this in real life, but it is dramatized, where he says, he calls himself the golden goose, right? He's like, I'm the golden goose. And one of the VCs says, like, like, no, dude, you're not the golden goose. You just have fortitude. And so it's like this big aha moment in the show, right? Because what it says is that you're not really that brilliant. And a lot of us could have had these similar ideas, or maybe even better ideas. But because this is such a tyrannical environment and you're kind of the only one in control here, you make all of the decisions. And yes, you're the one who kind of gets, the venture capital or whatnot. But at the end of the day, right, it's only because you suppress other voices, right? That yes, of course, who else is going to do it? So what we often find is that, yeah, it's the ones who are the loudest talkers that get their ideas out. And I love that you're saying that we should cultivate a sort of culture, right? Where even if there is, let's say, a leader, right? Even if we do have, and companies are doing this now, where you have somebody that's, let's say, the head and like they're in charge and they ultimately make the final decision. Maybe it's based on the vote, maybe not, whatever, either way might work. But the idea is that everybody's ideas are now taken seriously. It's not that everybody's ideas are implemented. That's not the point. It's just that what we see is that, again, for the most part, these people who are like, the kind of the robber barons of modern day, right? The CEOs, it's not so much that they're geniuses, right? I mean, there is something to that. I'm sure a lot of them do have very high IQs, but the point is to say that there's so many other people that if given a chance, they would have great ideas and they would maybe even make these companies run smoother than they do.
Yeah. And it's ironic that some of the institutions that are ahead on this is like the Army. So I don't know if you heard about after action reviews,
What's that?
And so they're having some recent ones. It literally says, okay, we just had a battle and we lost. I'm just making up a story, right?
Yep.
What they do is they gather the people that are involved, including the colonels and the generals, but all stripes are off. So all voices matter. All voices get to say, well, I was told to do X by this. And, and it's literally an after action review. It says, what happened? What are the facts that we can put on the table and say, why did so-and-so do X, or how did this unfold? And the beauty of that is, and I'm sure it's not hard for the guys with a lot of stripes, the colonels and the generals, but the beauty of it is that it's known that say, okay, this is it. It's a safe territory. Let's get real here. Let's really talk about what happened. And that takes courage.
Yeah, I love that.
Totally.
Especially if you're the guy with all the stripes.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah. In that kind of environment. Yeah. Actually setting outside a structure where like that doesn't matter for some set period of time, that's definitely good. One thing that's interesting to me is like how the frame of mind somebody is in really contributes to how they act in a team, like in the sense of like I think it was this book I read it a long time ago. I think it's called Good to Great, and they outlined the different types of views of the world. Like like it starts out from like a level 0 group to level 5. I kind of forget it a little bit, but here's the basic gist, where first mentality, the first type of mentality, which is the lowest, is I suck and the world sucks, like nobody's good. Then the next level is I'm good but everyone else sucks. Okay. Then our team is good but every other team sucks.
Other team, yes, right.
And then I think the last one is, we're all great. Like everything that like we all contribute is great. And then I realized that like these frames really matter, especially in teams, especially like with that story you were talking about with Wu-Tang. Like, yeah, you don't know who can, or maybe you do know who contributed what, but who gets like the credit and all of that. It kind of doesn't matter because in that team framework, there's this emergent that comes out of that collaboration, right? That there's this thing bigger than each individual. It's super important.
And I would just add also in sports. Sports, just FYI, in sports, this is like the main thing. That's all I'll say. So it's the main thing. So if you have like teams that don't contribute, where each person cares about their contribution, you'll have like a Lakers when Kobe Bryant was the star and like nobody else was doing well.
Yeah, exactly. And the other point of that book, Good to Great, that was really surprising to the researchers, because they didn't want to focus on the leaders. They wanted to focus on how did these companies and teams go from good to great. But a theme that came over and over and over and over again in their interviews was each leader knew they didn't have all the answers. They were weren't stuck in saying they had to know. And they were incredibly humble. Meaning they valued their employees, they valued the expertise of the people in the bus, people in the team, and their humility allowed them to learn from and let their team generate ideas and let their team come up with solutions. And that notion of humility is underappreciated, I think, because we think of it as a weakness where it's actually a strength.
Right.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, on the surface, people who think that displaying that they don't know something is weakness. That's interesting. That actually, when you do display that, you don't necessarily know that you don't have all the answers, and that maybe somebody else does and can contribute that and kind of play that role. Yeah, it just comes off incredibly authentic, right? Whereas you keep the frame of I'm always right, or I will be the one with the solution, even if I don't know what I'm doing. It has long-term negative effects in terms of how, I mean, not that it matters how other perceive you, but it does in a corporate structure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like they're like, oh, okay, this person is being authentic right now. I actually like this person more, therefore happy to work for them, with them,
With them,
as opposed to, oh, this person's really coming off rigid. This is like kind of a toxic work environment, doesn't listen to new ideas, and it's kind of taking us down this downward spiral.
Yeah, well, the opposite of humility is arrogance.
Right.
Yeah.
And that,
yeah, by the way,
that you can show up that way and not even be aware that you're showing up that way because you think you have to have the answer. Sorry.
By the way, no. So kind of as a joke, but also as a way to like kind of keep me humble. I know you guys can't see the shirt, but it says I might be wrong, but it's highly unlikely. So my cousin actually got this shirt for me, right? So her criticism I take because I love her, but what's funny about it, she's like, yeah, man, it's kind of like because you're kind of like that. You're kind of narcissistic at times, right? And I'm like, damn. I'm like, holy shit, right? But I kind of love that, right? And I wear this shirt sort of ironically, sort of not, but it's sort of to remind me, like, hey, you can't do this. You can't be like this.
Yeah, that's great. Good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah.
We all need all the help we can get.
Yeah. So, all right, Chuck, just, before we start, what?
Oh, just real quick,
Okay.
I have to say, I love that you mentioned, by the way, Eckhart Tolle in the book, or Tolle.
Yeah, Eckhart Tolle.
Yeah, and spiral dynamics. When I caught that, like near the end, I'm like, oh, okay, I don't see that often. That's cool. Out of curiosity, if you don't mind me asking, how did you get into spiral dynamics, or when did you first discover that?
So are you guys familiar with Ken Wilber?
Why does that sound so familiar? The name sounds so familiar.
Yeah, he's a really great thinker, philosopher, and I studied with him 15 years ago or so. And he introduced me to spiral dynamics because he had this notion of he's developed something called the integral theory, which is putting together objective reality and subjective the subjective world, too complex to go into. But then he introduced me to spiral dynamics because they have tracked sort of how we've evolved as human beings and how our minds and social and cultural norms have evolved over time. And so he combines that with his theories, and that's where it's through Ken Wilber that I get introduced to spiral dynamics. Yeah,
awesome.
And I just wrote an article. My watch is asking, saying they didn't know what I was saying. I didn't know she was listening.
They're always listening.
I just put an article in Psychology Today yesterday. It's about hope and truth and better conversations. And I mentioned in there this notion of having a bigger perspective on things, because a lot of things are not going well right now, that ultimately we are on this path of getting more and more conscious and awake as human beings, more tolerant, more all those things. And every time we make a leap forward, there's always a huge reaction, a negative reaction. So it's like it's upward path, but there's an up and then there's a big reaction. Then it comes back to the middle and there's this up and down. And so I bring that into the article to say, look there's a lot of crap going on, but keep your perspective, keep a meta perspective, and realize that if the positive growth is good for humanity and being more conscious, that always wins over the fearful reactions that are afraid of change.
I love that.
Totally.
And so as we start wrapping up, obviously, Chuck, we want to be mindful of your time. I also have to ask, right, because I think I'd regret it if we didn't. So can you tell us about some of the wisdom and some of the insights you gained from the Dalai Lama when you met him? Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, I, I was partly there because I was diagnosed with leukemia 30 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And so one of my friends in the picture was my wife and a friend. She also had a terminal diagnosis and she had since died. And so some of our conversations were about well-being and disease and health and death. And I think getting I think death can be a good teacher, and most of us think of it as we're afraid of it. But if we actually become more aware and awake to it, it can actually ground us in a way. So let's live life. Let's really take our day at a time and live life. So we had some good conversations about that. And he actually introduced us to his to his doctor, who we got to see twice, which was really, really cool too. So there was that piece. And then we did have some conversations about, he's a very simple thinker. I love his, fundamentally it's about kindness and tolerance, and he models that too, given the immense authority that his voice carries. And I'll tell you one funny story. My wife and I was married before, and I was in the middle of a divorce, and almost like I've had it with marriage, I'm done. And then I met my current wife, coincidentally through my work, and our first date, where we were in public together, was to see the Dalai Lama at a very small venue in Cambridge. It was before he became a rock star. And so we were with him, and my wife said, our first date was to see you speak. And he looked to his he had a advisor with him, and then he speaks pretty well English, but an advisor and someone to interpret. And he looked at his advisor and said, "What's date?" and when we told him what date was, he just went, "Wow!" He had this huge laughter, and he really got it, and that was just a really fun moment. And of course we had these lovely moments where we were touching and hugging and getting pictures taken. So yeah,
Wow,
it was great.
Man.
Yeah, what a life experience. So
Yeah,
all right, so
amazing.
Alan, final questions for Chuck before we wrap up.
Oh, yes. So, Chuck, if we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
Yeah, so the book is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. The publisher is Barrett Kohler. So if you don't want to go through those commercial things, you can go to Barrett Kohler. I am on Instagram, Chuck_Wisner. LinkedIn, same thing, Chuck_Wisner. And my website is chuckwisner.com.
All right, awesome, Chuck. Thank you
This
so
was
much.
amazing.
Yeah,
I'm surprised we're
Yeah.
even done, but
Yeah.
hey,
Yeah,
thank you,
it's
thank
great.
you so much for coming on.
Thank you for your time. Yeah.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you
care.
soon, man.
All right, bye.
Happy Easter.
All right. That was awesome. Okay. So, everyone, if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. We're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit the bell on YouTube.
And thank you again so much for watching, and see you next time.